Welcome to Darktide, where pretty much all everyone ever does is complain about the cash shop, throw lunchboxes, or shit on Psykers. The general consensus for Psykers is basically summed up like this, and if you're one of the warp charge soy jacks in the middle, give this build a listen to see if it changes your mind. And if it doesn't, please continue to soy jack in the comments, we can all laugh at you. Admittedly, the Soulblaze feats available are fucking terrible, and you don't actually pick any of them, except these two. Then you get to watch as the heretics are purged.
How about a magic trick? I'm gonna make this pencil disappear. Ta-da! It's gone.
Unfortunately, for any of this shit to make sense, I have to explain how Soulblaze actually works, and even if you're familiar with it already, I heavily encourage listening to this portion because it will change your gameplay. But if you want to be in this demographic, right here, then go ahead and skip to this timestamp where it's just the build. For those of you gigachads, buckle up because this shit gets kinda complicated. All the meat grinder cliffs are set to heresy and damnation already. Soulblaze is a damage over time effect that only Psykers, for now, can apply to enemies in the game. Currently, the only ways to apply it are through the Soulblaze specific feats or a Purgatus staff. Very simply put, you apply the dot and it times out on its own, dealing a non-fixed amount of damage. Remember that, it's important later. The damage scales exponentially per stack up to X stacks depending on the target hit. Too complicated? Well, it's about to get a lot worse. Bear with me here, it'll make sense. Fortunately, it only gets overwhelmingly complicated when you take into account there are several interesting properties that change its behavior, some of which I don't even know about yet. To understand the properties of Soulblaze and how they change, first we have to take a look at the types of enemies in the game it interacts with. Generally speaking, there are three types of normal mobs in the game: trash, elites, and specials. Though sometimes people put these two together and call them specialist, which I don't entirely agree with myself because one of them is a fucking dog. No matter how the damage stacks are manipulated, there are certain prerequisites before the calculations are made. For example, anything with carapace armor doesn't give a shit if you try and use any Soulblaze on it. However, not all elites are like that. It's easy to assume that all trash, most elites, and most specials will melt given they have 6+ stacks on them. Speaking of stacks, let's talk about those. How many can you get, what kinds of damage do they deal, and how does stack upkeeping work? From the rather extensive testing I've done, it seems that stacks no longer scale nearly as hard when you pass 12, if you can pass 12. Since there are 0 indicators of how many stacks are on a target other than counting them one at a time equal to current damage scaling in the meat grinder. I was going to list out how much damage each stack did until I found out that there's no fucking way I'm gonna do that, so all you gotta know to understand how complicated it is that 2 stacks, these dudes take 4 damage per second. The 3 dudes next to him take 7, the dregs take 5, these dudes are a mess, not to mention the
4 big guys
behind me, you get the point. The type of armor they wear matters the most. Note that the fully charged secondary attack applies like 6 to 8 stacks or something like that, so you can relax and just blast dudes for the most part. That means you actually have to charge and release it, which being reasonable given its decent range and stagger, means you're definitely going to get shot and die. Lastly, turns out stack upkeep is easier than expected. Since most enemies in the game will die before it's even relevant, it's not a big deal, but it is for bosses. You can simply hit them with 1 stack to sustain as many as you already have, as long as you don't let it time out, which is about 4.5 seconds. Now that we know how this works fundamentally, it's important to highlight a few distinct reasons why this mechanic by itself is really strong. There are ways to burst several stacks onto many targets at once, which once applied no longer need any of your attention to do all of its damage. Keep in mind that on Ascendant Blaze, 6 warp charges expended is equal to 6 stacks of Soulblaze to all targets hit. If you hit 50 enemies, which during a horde is likely to be on the small side of how many you can hit at a time, it's dealing approximately 2700 plus DPS. Let's say you only hit dregs, which each have over 200 health, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll multiply 200 alone. That's 10,000 damage minimum for pressing 1 button and nothing else. It also staggers on top of that, if it wasn't already enough as is. It doesn't matter if that number is slightly larger or smaller, That's a huge amount of damage that your team doesn't have to deal anymore to get through a room, or out of a sticky situation where you need to kill specials, but there's too much trash around to do it. Good thing there's a fucking Delete button. Best part is once you apply it, you can just get behind cover and wait for everything to die. Lastly, and by far the most unexplored, Soulblaze retroactively accounting for any damage amplifications, either from you or on the target. You could easily test this by picking the warp damage according to current peril feat and fluctuating your peril during the dot. The point is not that the feat says warp damage, it shows the damage can be amplified, which means there is a massive amount of experimentation possible with other coinciding status effects or debuffs in the game. That about wraps up the complicated part of all this, and I'm shifting over to how any of this shit translates to blasting dudes. Welcome back, timestamp enjoyers, you missed a lot, but you know, it's to each their own. Fun fact, you cannot click and drag the primary staff attack, it only applies Soulblaze in a line forward from the initial cast, but the secondary is active during the entire channel. Yeah, I know you didn't know that shit already. You might want to check out the other section, I'm just saying. Alright, here's the build. I don't have all transcendent items because I test a lot of combinations, and this isn't a prescription. Play it however it feels good to you. I take a combat blade so I can shank a bitch. It's also pretty good for schmooving, and complements my playstyle well. Being able to stop ranged enemies from shooting me with a quick flame and closing the distance quickly to force them all into melee fuels the Zealot fantasy with the Psyker's kit that I was looking for. Daring, I know, but you take the Purge staff. Then for curios, I like to take 1 or 2, depending on how dummy hard you go in, extra wounds, which is the only thing I would consider required, just for safety. We don't have the insane damage reduction Zealots do, so sometimes you'll end up in a bad situation and get blown up. Accompanied by any combination of which you favor, I prefer some stamina, stamina regen, block efficiency, health, toughness, etc. For feats, I like to take any of the first 3, then 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. For 5, I think any of the toughness perks are good for different reasons. Preference here. For 10, the options here are all kind of ass for the build, but peril resistance is great for many reasons. And since you'll likely spend most of the mission at 6 stacks without using Brain Burst much, it helps span the staff, gives you extra damage for your knife, and makes kinetic shield better. Rack and Ruin would be an option if the 3 meters wasn't smaller than dog shit. Like actual dog shit. It's really bad. Not to mention 2 stacks is 4 DPS. There are very few situations where it would be good, it's just not even remotely as applicable as peril resistance. Personally, I'd love to see some tuning for the Soulblaze specific feats. For 15, easy pick here, all of them are good, but Psychic Communion fits really well, and you have to Brain Burst last when you pick it, so that's a plus. For 20, both Deflection and Shield are great. If you like using Force Sword with Deflection Blessing, then Deflection is for you, but otherwise, taking less damage is always a viable option. For 25 and 30, which are the crux of the entire build, are mandatory, which are Warp Battery and the Scented Blaze. You can run this with Kinetic Slayer, and admittedly, it is pretty fucking cool. But I'm telling you the difference between 4 Soulblaze stacks and 6 is not worth it to trade that off. But if you fucking hate brain bursting anything, Kinetic Slayer makes it so you don't have to so long as you hit shit. Flaming anything with your staff will proc it almost immediately, though I've never seen it proc on the dot itself. I'll be showing different moments from Heresy and Damnation as I go on. For gameplay, I like to mix mostly aggression with the occasional brain burst Andy, since I don't mind it much. And this build really lacks damage to deal specifically with Crushers and Bulwarks. Crushers just don't give a shit, and Bulwarks, well, yeah, this just doesn't really look right. If you use a Force Sword, then it fixes that issue, but miss me with that shit I like zooming. Since the build is about hitting masses of enemies with Soulblaze via your ability, there may be moments where if you want to stick with that gameplay loop, you'll simply have to Brain Burst occasionally to keep your 6 stacks up, since doing it once to maintain it is much less tedious than entering a room you wish you had 6 stacks with and having to get them all again to utilize them. Or your teammates won't get in the fucking elevator, and your stacks time out by the time you get out of it. When you have the stacks and use your ability, it hits in a wide cone in front of you, expanding in width as it travels, so keep that in mind when you choose where to cast it from. You can totally bust all your charges and just miss the shit you were trying to hit if you're too close to it. That's easily the best way to completely kill your warp charge momentum and have to brain burst your way back up if you to get rolling again. Whenever I see a large amount of ranged enemies of any type pinning us down or a horde, I'll ignite them. If you hit all of them, it will kill most of them and leaves the elites with less than half HP even on Damnation. Ascendant Blaze gives us a 10% chance to get a warp charge if the enemy dies from a Soulblaze effect, so if you hit a lot of enemies, you get most if not all back at once. I don't believe I've ever ignited a horde and not gotten 6 stacks back instantly. If you don't, you can get stacks very quickly by flaming down a horde or a bunch of shooters with secondary fire on the staff. No need to brain burst. Just remember that one pop is easier to deal with than Gamba at every opportunity, but I respect that. Do you remember how far the knockback is? You can knock a dog off your teammate and give them a second chance at life, whether they are close or far away if you're quick enough before the mobs around the disabled teammate down them. Even with 6 stacks, it'll hurt the dog but not kill it. Very useful in tight situations. If you need to use it and don't have stacks, fuck the stacks, just use it. Chances are the 1 stack you ignite with will return more stacks to you than you consumed. Lastly, don't be a little bitch. Get in there and slay out. The build isn't tuned to sit back and shoot charged Void Strike balls, or brain burst repeatedly from the backlines. I'm not here to gatekeep how to play Psyker, but getting up in there is the most enjoyable way to play this build in my opinion. It's much easier to sustain warp charges without having to use brain burst all the time if you're playing aggressively. This build is much different than most I've seen other Psykers running, and I hope it's as much of a breath of fresh air as it has been for me. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, reach out on my Discord, or you can ask me personally on my stream over on Twitch, which are linked in the description. If you enjoyed yourself, like the video and share it with someone. Do that shit. Bitch.
Unacceptable.